Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I know a lot of us are getting back to our offices. Some kids are back to school, and we're trying to get back to some semblance of normality. We're continuing to do our housing forum online to be as cautious as we can, but we'll figure this out from housing forum to housing forum. Our topic today is one that is on the minds of many in the city of Atlanta: residential zoning. And there's nothing harder to talk about or maybe more emotional. The city's population is expected to grow to over 1 million residents in the next several decades. Simply put, we don't have enough affordable, or for that matter, enough of any kind of housing to serve the city's needs. 1 in every 2 households in the city are housing cost burden. Rising rents, stagnant wages over the years, and how COVID and the threat of eviction are making matters worse. There's a compelling need to create a denser community and to do so in an equitable manner. Let us not forget, single-family residential zoning has been used since 1916 to keep minorities out of white neighborhoods. We've had some programs on that previously. Over time, these zoning practices have restricted the development of accessory dwelling units, duplexes, townhouses, and apartments, thereby inhibiting housing supply. And it has been an instrument of both widening income inequality and racial segregation for more than a century. You might say, Bill, you're exaggerating. Well, am I? A report from the University of California at Berkeley stated in June that of the 150 large metropolitan regions, which we are in, 81% are more segregated today than they were 30 years ago. So we have these moments in time where we could make a different decision. We could plan in a different way. We could come to the housing forum and other mediating places in town to really have a discussion to talk about the city we want to create. So how will we house residents in the future? More importantly, how will we do this in an equitable manner? Atlanta is not alone in this matter. Jurisdictions around the metro and around the nation are struggling with affordable housing. Cities from coast to coast are updating zoning practices as a means of addressing equity in affordable housing. Places like Portland, or Minneapolis, or Berkeley, or more locally, because you may say, oh, those are cities far away from us. More locally, Charlotte, North Carolina. Today, we talk to a Charlotte City Council member involved in their effort. We'll discuss why this issue is so important to Atlanta and the region. We'll talk with zoning experts to understand why reform is needed and the status of pending proposals in Atlanta. And we'll talk with zoning reform supporters and others who are engaging the community on the ground. And we'll discuss ways you can get engaged. And that really is the bottom line. How are we going to be informed, be educated, and be engaged in the community? Before we get started, let me ask George Bergen to see who we have in the audience today. George, could you do the poll?
Good morning, Bill. Folks, we've posted in the chat room a link, or if you'll go on your smartphone, your mobile device, your computer, whatever you're using, go to menti.com, www.menti.com, and use the code 70816707. It's on your screen, or you can use the link that we've just posted in the various chat streams. Give that just a second, Bill. Bill, we got over 500 people registered for the event. Our thanks to our presenters who helped sort of rebroadcast the message. We're excited for this morning's topic. We always, at the forum, and 35 years, we are usually very accustomed to having a pretty broad cross-section. We're a little heavy this time on registrations from the government sector, right? So from state, local, and federal government officials, as this topic obviously impacts policy on the local level. So there's a lot of folks interested in hearing the presentations and conversations that we're having. So we're excited. Looks like this morning so far, Bill, is no different than our previous. We've got a lot of private sector, good amount of public sector, usually a pretty fair balance between nonprofit developers and nonprofit service providers and advocacy organizations, and as always, our concerned citizens, folks who are taking it from their time to be with us. So we'll keep monitoring that, but it appears, Bill, to be our normal, excellent, diverse crowd of folks who are engaged in these housing matters.
And you know, George, when we started this years ago, our intention was to have a diverse audience. Our intention was to have people from every sector. So it's one of the great assets I think we have, that we come together representing often different constituencies, different roles in the community, that we've come to one table to learn together and to figure out how to make things better.
Absolutely. We do miss the donuts, though.
Yeah, well, one day we'll be back together.
All right. Thanks, sir.
Before we get into our program, let me remind you that you'll have time for questions between presenters today. Now that depends on the presenter staying on time, but we always try to have an opportunity for you to make comments or ask questions. Please make your comments and questions on the chat or comment section of the broadcast on YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter. We'll get to as many questions as time permits. For those who want to continue the conversation, and this is something an increasing number of people are choosing to do, after the forum, there will be another small group discussion on Zoom. You will receive an email from the Zoom link, discussion guide, and more. The information will also be available at the web address you see on the screen now. So now, on with the program, and I'm on time so far, George, so let's get started. Let me ask somebody I deeply respect and a veteran in the field, James Alexander from Mercy Housing Southeast. He's also a member of the Forum Steering Committee, to join us. So James, thanks for being here. We've spoken a lot about the history of race-based housing policy and issues of equity and opportunity at the Forum events this year. Why is zoning important to creating a more affordable and equitable city, a city for all? James, help frame it out for us.
Okay. Thanks, Bill, for inviting me to this, and have enjoyed working with the team on this forum and the forums throughout the year. I think this is going to be a really good one. To answer your question, it's because zoning is a primary tool to regulate the use of land. And how we choose to regulate land is an expression of who we want to be and who we want to welcome in our region, in our cities, and also in our neighborhoods. And I'm sure y'all have heard that quote by Mark Twain and his observation about land, which is they're not making it anymore. So the choices that we make as it relates to the regulation of land and land is critical. And I think you're absolutely right, Bill, that we're in a moment that we haven't been before as it relates to zoning in the Atlanta region and making choices and decisions about that. So how are we currently choosing to zone in the Atlanta region, and what message are we sending about who is welcome? Here are some examples. We choose to zone approximately 60% of our land for single-family housing in the city of Atlanta. And in Sandy Springs, it's closer to 85%. So if you're an essential service worker who cannot afford a single-family home, in some cases, either for sale or for rent, you're working at Target, delivering meals, working at Kroger, working as a nurse's aide, people who really dragged us through this pandemic. Where are you going to go? In a lot of senses, those people are squeezed out and they're zoned out. This in the field is called exclusionary zoning, and it really prevents a more equitable region. So more specifically, here are some problems that exist with exclusionary zoning that we're going to hear in the presentations today, just in terms of some themes that we'll see today. So one, zoning out missing middle and multifamily housing really restricts the supply of housing, which increase the cost of housing. So there's some general consensus that increasing the supply of housing over time can really dampen the cost of housing. And we'll hear more about that from Eric Kronberg. Whether this strategy really gets down to the lower levels of area median income, where the need is greatest, is debatable. But overall, more supply is necessary, and it can certainly open up opportunities for workforce households. And as Bill mentioned, we need more supply if we want to continue to grow as a region. The second big problem is, practically speaking, zoning out missing middle and multifamily housing really squeezes out lower income people, and by extension, unfortunately, Black families. It really segregates our region. And you heard Bill's statistics about how regions are becoming more and more segregated over time. Zoning historically has segregated our cities by design, as we learned in a previous housing forum, and for those of y'all who have picked up The Color of Law, and for those who have just been, living in our regions over the years. White neighborhoods were zoned as single family or lower density to make it difficult for Blacks to afford to integrate these neighborhoods. And today, cities can't zone explicitly based on race, although the city tried in the early 1900s. Also, individuals and lenders cannot legally discriminate in housing transactions based on race, although people still do and try. Legally, that's not allowed. But cities can do this. They can only zone residential parcels as single-family half-acre lots, or they can decide to not add missing middle or multifamily zoning in their comprehensive plans as they plan for the future. This approach practically zones out many Black families and is not as welcoming as it should be, in my opinion. And it's an example of a remnant of institutional racism that exists today. So many people want more diversity in their neighborhoods. They want to live in places where everybody just doesn't look like them, and a more inclusive housing approach via zoning would support this. Today, we'll hear how some folks in the city of Atlanta and Sandy Springs are approaching this. So 3, subsidy alone isn't going to solve the affordable housing problem. And don't get me wrong, it's an extremely important part of the equation, but there's just not enough money to buy ourselves out of this situation. Zoning changes are an important part of the equation, and zoning alone can't do it too, and let's not be fooled about that. It's also a cost-efficient one. So as zoning can be a powerful tool to exclude people from communities, it can also be a powerful tool to include and to make our region a more equitable place. In a few ways. One, it can be a significant contribution to supply, which we'll hear more about. 2, it's a more democratized approach. I think, the folks who are producing a lot of housing and advocating for housing are some of the usual suspects that you tend to see over and over again. What I love about it is that it's more democratized from a production perspective and a policy perspective. So if you own a house and you have a backyard, you have the ability to contribute to solving this problem. You can build out a basement unit or an accessory dwelling unit if the zoning allows you to do that. Also, from an advocacy perspective and a policy perspective, individuals can advocate at the dinner table, in neighborhood meetings, at city council, for more inclusive housing policies and zoning policies. And, I've seen just in my work, trying to deliver affordable housing over the years, really sometimes it's just 1 or 2 people who have decided to take it upon themselves to welcome this kind of housing and to convince their neighbors that it's worthwhile, who make all the difference. So there's a lot of power that people and individuals have in this effort, and it just depends on how we choose to use it. And we'll hear more from people who have been using that power today. 3, it's a market-based approach. And, it really advocates for removing zoning restrictions as opposed to adding them, and zoning restrictions that artificially hamper supply. Finally, it's a reparative approach in nature. And we learned about the importance of identifying historic injustices and addressing them directly through Robin Rue Simmons in the February forum. And given that single family zoning is rooted deeply in a racist history, there's an opportunity to really reshape a system built with the foundation of systematic racism. So there's an ability to directly address it. So hopefully that helps to frame up why zoning matters and some of what we are about to hear today. And I'm looking forward to more conversation.
Thanks so much, James. It was very thoughtful and I think a great frame for our program today. I would just come back again, zoning out the missing middle. That's a term, but what we're talking about are the people that serve our food, who take care of our children, who police our streets, who are offering health care on the front lines. These are the folks that we want to be with, who want to serve us, and I think we'd be happy to live with. So very important that we get the right image of who we're talking about. We know there's no silver bullet. It's not just zoning. We're focusing on zoning today. We've talked throughout the year about different tools. It's complex. At the end of the day, what we're talking about is changing consciousness, of finding a way to have real conversations in a trusted place so that we can kind of get beyond some of the fears and images that we may have. So again, thanks, James. It's very helpful. Let's move on and let's go deeper in today's topic. Let me ask Eric Kronberg and Elizabeth Ward of Kronberg Urbanists and Architects to join us. Welcome, Eric and Elizabeth. This is your firm's field of expertise. That's why we called them. Help us understand the issues a bit better. And following James' remarks, can you help share why there's a compelling need for zoning reform now?
Bill, thank you so much for having us. We're happy to dive into this. And Elizabeth is going to start with some context setting. Then I'm going to jump in and talk about some specific zoning reforms in Atlanta. So Elizabeth, it's all you.
That's right. Everybody seeing my screen? We're all good? Okay, thanks. So like Eric said, I'm Elizabeth Ward. We're going to be talking today about the links between housing affordability, housing choice, zoning, with a specific eye to the zoning reforms that are proposed in Atlanta today. This is us. This is KUA. We are a design firm that specializes in neighborhood infill and redevelopment and all of the fun stuff that goes along with that. So like Eric said, we're going to start out by just setting some context. So it's not news to anyone. Atlanta's growing. You've heard these numbers thrown around a lot. We are today bigger than we've ever been, with a population of 500,000. And we're expected to grow to 1.2 million people by 2040. So that's an increase of 700,000 people in our city in the next 19 years. And of course, this is not happening in a bubble. The metro area is expected to grow to nearly 3 million people by 2050. So what we're seeing in the city is really a share of this larger regional growth. This is a great graphic from the Atlanta City Design that charts the growth of the city, our population and land area over time. Some important takeaways from this. So on the left, you'll see the city in 1940, that orange blob, that was our land area. We were about 300,000 people then, and we had a population density of about 8,500 people per square mile. So fast forward to today, again, we've grown to 500,000 people, but our land area has grown, we've quadrupled in land area. So what this means is our density has gone down significantly. We are less than half as dense as we were about 80 years ago. Which is probably not surprising to hear. We are one of the least dense major cities in the country. But if we look at Atlanta when we were at our most dense, there are some key lessons we can learn. The first is that the core of our city, what you see here, what's really our most walkable neighborhoods in the city, most of this was built before we had zoning. A second important point is that Atlanta was originally a transit-oriented city. So the growth and the scale of the city was calibrated to walkability and to access to transit. So the blue lines you see here are historic streetcar lines. And the third thing is that when the city did adopt zoning, so this is one of our city's first zoning maps from 1929, the zoning that we adopted was a lot simpler and more inclusive than it is today. So we had a total of 4 zoning districts, 4. Dwelling house district, apartment house district, business, and industrial. What's important about these is that the dwelling house district, which was our least dense district, it allowed single family homes, duplexes, attached and detached ADUs, and even some small businesses. And the apartment house district, which you can see here in yellow, notice that it's concentrated around these blue streetcar lines. So we were concentrating our denser development along our transit routes. So these are going to be really important when Eric starts talking about zoning reform. Keep these in mind. How we're proposing to change zoning today is not dissimilar to how we were structuring our city originally. Also remember that we were twice as dense then than we are now. And this is before we had things like high-rise apartment towers and large-scale apartment complexes. So back to the growth of the city, we hit our previous peak population in the 1970s at just under 500,000, and we've only this year surpassed that point. So like a lot of cities around the country, we saw population decline with white flight. And so we have been okay up to this point with housing affordability because white flight left relatively affordable housing options for the decreased population that we saw in the city, but we've now surpassed that point. And another important thing to note is that in the 1970s, our household size was very different at our previous peak population. So the average household size was more than 3 people per household. Today in Atlanta, we're closer to 1.5 or 2 people per household. So we've surpassed the population, our previous peak, and we need more housing to support that same number of people now based on household size. Eric's going to dig more into these numbers, but suffice it to say that we are under delivering housing on an annual basis in Atlanta significantly. So we need more housing, just full stop across the board. But we need more housing types, and we need more housing types to support our changing demographics and to increase our affordability and diversity, which are stated goals that we have for the city and the region. And we need more housing in walkable locations, so really proximate to transit. So when we talk about that 700,000 number, it's not just some large abstract number. These are our future neighbors coming to the city, and how we house them or choose not to house them is a really important and urgent issue for those of us who live here right now. So we've painted a picture of growth in the city. This is a slide from the Atlanta City Design. A growing city does not have to be a less affordable one. It's also important to note that it's not growth that's causing the unaffordability that we're seeing in the city today. It's really a lack of housing supply. And so we can look at other cities around the country, the Portlands, the Austins, we can see the issues that they're facing and know that we have a chance to course correct right now if we allow increased housing supply. Increased housing supply is shown to increase affordability and decrease displacement. And we know those are bold statements. We've linked to some great research on this topic below. But the basic premise is if there's not enough housing supply to meet demand, then higher income people will buy down the ladder. So if they can't find housing at their price point, they will buy traditionally lower or middle income housing stock, which causes the displacement and the gentrification that we see so much of today. And it's also important to note that a lot of the jobs that are attracting the growth in residents to the city are attracting people at these higher income brackets. So this really doesn't bode well for people that earn less. A less abstract example, this is a project that we've been working on in the English Avenue neighborhood in Atlanta. This is a vacant lot we've been working on with a nonprofit development partner. Like most single family lots in the city, the as of right condition allowed for 1 detached for sale home per lot, and development costs being what they are, the home would need to sell for about 120% or more of area median income, which is not affordable to most people in the English Avenue neighborhood. And so we worked with the community on a rezoning to allow for 4 homes on 4 small lots. And so what this does is it increases the affordability and the home ownership opportunities and opportunities for people to build wealth in the neighborhood. So these price points are much more affordable to people that live in the neighborhood and allows them to stay in the neighborhood. So this is a more concrete example of how increasing housing supply from the 1 to the 4 units increases affordability and minimizes displacement. We've got a deep dive on the numbers here over on our blog. So how do we get more of the housing that we need? We need to allow housing choice. And what's housing choice? It's pretty simple. It's a variety of housing types and sizes on a variety of lot sizes with a variety of mobility options to support a variety of people. And so that last one is so important. And without the first three things, you cannot do the last thing. You cannot support a variety of people. So without housing choice, we will certainly fall short of our goals that we've set for ourselves as a city and a region of being equitable, diverse, and affordable. What does housing choice look like? It really looks like our traditional neighborhood development patterns. These are some examples of our built work in the city of Atlanta, and just want to note that every single one of these projects required a zoning change to be possible. So we're making it really difficult in our city right now to provide housing choice. And with that, I'm going to let Eric share his screen and talk about zoning reform.
And literally right on time. That is awesome. So share screen, screen one, share. Leave you guys to the side. And can you guys, is my screen, yep, shared. Elizabeth looks good, right?
Can't see it.
There we go. Yep. Okay. There we go. Great. So we're talking about some current zoning reforms in the city of Atlanta. I want to break down some of those numbers. We worked with a good friend, Ben King, to pull this stuff together. Ben took some time to compare census data for permitting along with CoStar and normalize an average across 2013 to 2019 to see how many units per year of different types we've been producing in the city of Atlanta. These are the numbers from his outcome, and he wanted to normalize across several years because, permits shows when a project starts, CoStar shows when a project delivers, and to make sure there's not double counting or undercounting, he normalized across several years. You'll see at the top 57, 51, 70, almost 1,500 units per year. If we're going to hit that, provide housing to accommodate that 700,000 people, that needs to get up to about 16,000 at the bare minimum. So want to paint you a sense of where we're at, what we're building, and where we need to go. And so the big question is, can we meet our housing needs with single family and large scale apartments? Because that's what we're doing right now, right? When you look at the percentage of ADUs and 12 plexes, duplexes up, it's not much. To note, single family attached and detached do fall into, and townhome fall into this 730 number right here. But again, that's only 14% of what we're building. So almost 86% of our housing is coming from high-rise and garden and mid-rise apartments in terms of new housing. These are some of the most expensive forms of housing to provide, and therefore some of the least affordable housing to subsidize when we're trying to do workforce housing. It's also really important to point out that we only build what we legally allow, right? Particularly for smaller scale projects. It's not worth the brain damage to rezone to a 12-plex case by case. So we spent some time with Ben. He did a lot of census tract data analysis and mapping, and looking at mapping our neighborhoods to see what do we think we can do? What would it take to get to the 16,600 units per year based on a lot of analysis of household size and everything else. The numbers you're seeing in magenta or red are the added number of units that we would need to get to add on to what we're providing. Now, we took a lot of time with Ben to look at place-based context, but you could think that maybe we'll do less ADUs and more single family or more garden. Like regardless, this is the delta that we need to get to. Going from 5,000 to 7,000 units of housing a year to at least 16,000, it's a doubling or tripling. And here's the thing. This is only going to happen if we make it legal, if we're going to try to spread across these different types of housing, if we don't think we can do it all with single family and mid-rise and high-rise. And so these are the total number of units that we need right here per type, so that's a lot of units, across the board. And if we're going to get ahead of our housing challenge and affordability challenges, we are going to have to figure out ways to get to this. And from a percentage basis, what we're targeting is looking at different percentages, again, that we think is reasonable. And again, if somebody says, I think we can do more garden mid-rise and less ADUs, I don't know that we can do any of these at the amounts we're saying. And so we're not going to push back. But what we are going to say is like the overall number of the 16,000 is what matters. We should work together to figure out the best way to get there across the various housing options we have. And we need to ask ourselves, do we want to be a city of only single family and large scale apartments? That's what we're doing now. Is that what makes for a great inclusive community? And also, are we willing to accept the consequences of not changing? And we see decreased housing affordability, which we're seeing on the ground right now, decreased diversity, increased traffic because we're not densifying at transit appropriately, and increased property taxes to pay for services we're not densifying appropriately either. Like, is this what we want to be as an Atlanta? So when we look at these ADUs and duplexes, from our math, which, general stab at this stuff, looks at potentially up to 42% of our annual housing production could come from stuff that is either partially legalized in ADUs or not effectively legalized at all in 12plexes. So zoning is specifically limiting production of housing here that we see as an absolutely crucial portion of what we got to do to get to our housing numbers to house and includes a city for all. And we also want to point out that small format housing like ADUs and 12plexes are the most effective non-subsidized way of delivering workforce and affordable housing. Let me repeat that. It's the most effective way to deliver non-subsidized housing, and we make this functionally illegal. You wonder why it's so hard to find workforce housing in the city. Like, if it's not legal, it's not going to happen. So we need more housing types of all kinds, more types of housing, and we need zoning reform to unlock this missing middle in particular. Quick shout out to the CDP. You know, the city took a stab on Office of Housing and Community Development to try to a reasonable update. They got blasted, and they have already walked back most of the moderately meaningful changes they tried to include. So if you care about what we're talking about, I think we need to make for a better city. City council members need to hear from you. People on this call need to be reaching out about the CDP, but more importantly, about the zoning reforms we're about to talk about. Amir Faruqi introduced a couple pieces of legislation. I'm going to walk through that right now. It tackles 4 key areas. It removes all residential parking requirements across the city. It would allow attached ADUs in R4 and R5, which is not currently allowed. It would allow fee simple ADUs, which I could talk an hour about why it's important, but I'll touch on this briefly. And then it allows for MRMU or missing middle within a half mile of MARTA stations and makes some important tweaks to how that zoning category works. Quick message on parking reforms. You know, we got our parking requirements years ago from the ITE, International Transportation Engineers. They came out 3 years ago saying that we should scrap all parking requirements across all cities in America, and also knowing that's an important step of scrapping these to developing affordable housing and looking at case studies where this has already happened from Buffalo to Hartford and across the country. We need to catch up. Basically, it's pretty simple. Remove minimum parking requirements for all residential uses. This allows the market to provide housing we need versus arbitrary regulations. It helps with housing affordability. Pretty straightforward. Attached ADUs. An attached ADU is a much more affordable way to provide an ADU than building a whole separate building in the back of a lot, from land disturbance, lot coverage, utilities across the board. Here's another example of what this could look at when you look at an attached ADU versus a detached ADU. We currently allow detached ADUs in R4 and R5 right now. The proposal is to allow attached as an option. It allows for attached and detached in R5 or one or the other in R4. Again, more affordable. This is a great way to help limit teardowns because you put a new cottage in the existing building, it becomes more economically viable, provides more housing choices, and makes it less susceptible economically to a teardown for a new McMansion. So we see this as doing a lot of good. When we talk about fee simple ADUs, which means that you could sell off the back or the back portion of a corner lot, we see this as a huge way for increasing wealth creation and providing housing choices because these ADUs are capped at 750 square feet. They have to be small. There's an inherent affordability in small housing that just comes with that, even if it's a high dollar per square foot price point. These are things that we would hope to allow with the new legislation. And you can also do an ADU in the back. This is what this can look like. You know, it looks like a lot of what our traditional neighborhoods looked like previously. The flag lots will have to be separately, like I mentioned. And it also allows for partial equity cash outs to minimize displacement. So right now, your choice, if you're a legacy homeowner, is to sell and leave and cash out, try to find somewhere else to live. This provides more fractional ways to sell part of your lot to be able to maintain life in your community. And going forward to MRMU, this I'll talk about the specifics of this zoning category, but just to start out, this is the map that's accompanying the legislation. All these little dark boxes are where we're talking about. It is a relatively small portion of land in our city. These are basically R5 lots that are close to transit. That is where things are happening. It is not widespread or all over. It is very limited in scope. And it's very transit oriented per Elizabeth's previous comments about how we used to build. Really quickly, it's looking at rezoning of properties within a half mile walk distance, not crow flies distance of MARTA stations. It would allow 1 to 4 units by right. Those could be separate cottages. They could not be attached townhomes. They could be small format apartment buildings. So it's only 1 to 4. If you want to unlock more housing choice, you have to start providing affordability that's deed restricted as part of it. So if you want to go to 5 to 8 one rental unit has to come in at 60% of AMI, or one for sale unit at 80% of AMI. And if you want to get up to 12, 2 rental units at 60% of AMI or 2 for sale units at 80% of AMI. You also have to unbundle your parking. You cannot lease or sell the parking with the unit as a way to promote affordability and to sever vehicle storage from home ownership options or rental options. And again, really in a critical way to include more housing by transit in an inclusionary zoning fashion. And the density bonus is one of the few legal ways we can provide IZ outside the Beltline. And for folks that understand what I'm talking about, this is why this type of a optional opt-in is critical to get more workforce housing in more parts of the city. And just to show you what this looks like, this is in Charles Allen Drive in Midtown, 20 inch, we're not even talking 20 inch, but that's what 20 inch looks like next to a single family house. I think everybody's alive and doing fine. I think it's working here. Here's over in Virginia Highlands. We've got 18 units next to a single family house, nothing radical or crazy. Here's another 18 units next to a single family unit. When we talk about under the tree line of and at the scale of the community, this is what we're talking about. And a few other quick shout outs for some zoning pioneers to set the stage. Durham's done a lot of great work in allowing fee simple ADUs. We push a lot of what their ideas were to share with the city here to try to keep us moving forward. We've got a blog post that talks through all the reforms and the great leadership their mayor exhibited in city council to get this done. Portland, Austin, Minneapolis have all done some interesting housing reforms and zoning modifications, all geared towards tying in affordability. I could talk a long time about this, but it's a really, I say, delicate or a challenging balance of how much do you allow the market and supply side to increase your housing stock, how much affordability you require to couple with that, and how much subsidy do you have to provide if you require a greater amount of affordability. So Sightline Institute did a great deep dive into Portland's math for their zoning. Austin, we've got a link to what they're doing to unlocking affordability, and Minneapolis has some stuff there as to how they're not really working because fourplexes don't pencil. And if you only allow fourplexes, you're probably not going to get a lot of housing. Lastly, we're seeing more and more state level action must be necessary to get to the core of this. North Carolina tried some stuff. It didn't make it very far this past session, but even North Carolina is looking at legalizing fourplexes everywhere as a standard across the state. And what you can do to promote housing choice really fast, if you're an affordable housing advocate, be a housing advocate. And we like to break down the numbers as much as we can. Contact your council person, lead the community, conversation your community. But at the end of the day, it's 8 votes. 8 votes in city council to pass the mayor's legislation is what this boils down to for now. Thank you.
Wow, Eric. It's always a judgment call. We could give you and Elizabeth a couple of hours. You have such relevant information. As we kind of move on to see if there's Q&A, Eric, if you could leave up the slide with the units needed so
yes,
we can just see that, and then we'll get to the next session. I would take note, Elizabeth, to your point, that 80 years ago, we were more dense than we are today. That's 2 generations back. So we need to remember that, this is not new. We would go back to a city we were proud of then to have more density. And Eric, the point that we can't do this unit by unit. It's really got to be in the city plan. And the council has got to pass policy, to allow this kind of creativity to happen in every neighborhood across the city. I just think that's so important. And to the point that we're not alone. This is a national issue. George, let's take a moment to see if we have some questions we could get answered quickly. What do we got? What communities do you think are priorities for changing zoning to be more inclusive and increase density? Eric or Elizabeth, where do we go first?
Elizabeth, go ahead, because I know you got it.
Yeah, well, I think it goes back to the point about how we used to build our city around transit and the proposed legislation today with the mayor. The priority should really be on our walkable communities that have access to transit. That is the most equitable way, and that is the way that makes the most sense for how we grow.
I would add on to that that's critical for Atlanta, but I would say even further, we need to look at housing choices for communities that have mobility options. And I'm talking about this from a regional perspective for the Covingtons, for the Duluths, for the places that don't necessarily have MARTA stations out to them yet, but where you have walkable amenity for jobs and retail and shopping and grocery, which is your downtown, your main streets, allowing housing choice to support those core communities is how this is going to also have to play out in these suburban places as well.
You know, I can remember, Eric, a link trip to Dallas that John Williams, a developer, took us out to show us this very concept. And we're 20 years now into it and, you know, still hadn't realized, you know, that vision. Thanks, Eric Speakman, for that last question. Maria Supporter, how can we increase our density without reducing our tree canopy? And this is always, you know, there's tension that we can't just do housing in without the larger context. So what happens to our trees? Because we've got folks who care about that.
So Elizabeth's on the tree commission, so I'll say a few things, but she's also has some thoughts. I think our take is it's really critical to think about what I say the moral obligation of our land in our city. And I think the context matters a lot for this. And land that is directly adjacent to transit has a different moral obligation than land that is not. And what I mean by that is if you're a lot that is right next to a train station, your moral obligation for that land for that housing is greatly increased. If you're not close or walkable to a train station, it's a very different context. And so looking at ways to increase housing options by trains means that when you're closer to a train, there will be different trade-offs than when you're not. I also think that you know, legacy trees or historic trees or high value trees should always have priority, but high value land directly adjacent to transit should also have priority. And our conservation areas, you know, we have a lot of land not by transit that we should have robust tree protections as well.
You know, and Maria's question really informs me, and I think all of us, that we've got to find allies. We've got to find folks who care about different aspects of the community to come together and say all these things are important. Really
quick, just on that, Bill, you know, we've been talking for a long time. We are completely fine politically if Atlanta comes up with a really robust tree ordinance because, you know, politically that makes sense. We're also fine with that so long as there are carve outs for affordability, right, in proximity to transit. So we have to have a balancing act, but we should protect our trees robustly across the city, but also prioritize inclusion next to trains.
Excellent. Excellent. So again, we're coming back to creating the city for all folks. We know where to focus first. We know the groups that we need to ally with and find common solutions. And we look to folks like you for the data, for the ideas, and for the advocacy. So Eric and Elizabeth, thank you very much. I wish we had longer to talk, but we'll have you back.
All right, thank you all.
Okay, as I mentioned earlier, there is a city that we often consider a sister city, Charlotte. We're tracking each other closely, and they've had some real developments there that I think is important for us to pay attention to. We reached out to Charlotte Council member Braxton Winston, a great backstory. He went to Davidson College. He got involved while he was in college, kind of in public policy issues, and then went on to serve on the council. So he's been a real champion at the city level. Charlotte, very much like Atlanta, was using an old plan. I mean, I think their plan was 40 years old. So all their development had been willy-nilly and not very, comprehensive. So had a great interview with Councilman Winston. They have created or adopted the City Council Charlotte 2040 Comprehensive Plan. Now, detail rules on the Unified Development Ordinance. It's a zoning policy, will not be voted on until spring of 2020. I think we really need to pay attention to what they're doing, and Councilman Winston offered to be in contact, to be a resource to us, and they're very interested in what we're doing in Atlanta. So, George, if you can play that interview. The council person could not be here this morning at this time, so we did an interview before. George? So, Councilman Winston from Charlotte, North Carolina, we welcome you to the Regional Housing Forum. I've been looking forward to this conversation and looking forward to learning a lot about how you've brought about some of the change that we like to think about here in Atlanta, how you've done that in Charlotte. What a great job you've done there. And I know it's not just you, it's a whole team of people. And from reading the articles, it really was a campaign to try to get away from the scare tactics and away from the fear of change. But I really appreciate you taking time to be with us. Can you tell us kind of how this change came about? Was it community-led or council-led? Was it kind of bubbled up from the community? And how you came to seek residential zoning reform in Charlotte? If you could just speak to that to begin with.
As well, first off, it's always good to take a virtual trip down 85. You know, I think the traffic is a little less of a problem. You know, this will only be second to that high-speed rail that we can make happen to connect our two cities, hopefully in the next within the next generation. But to answer your question, you know, this housing conversation really did come out, and in specific, our comprehensive plans, this elimination of single-family exclusionary zoning really did come out of a community conversation that has been happening for a longer period in time. It culminated in 2016 after Keith Lamont Scott was killed by Charlotte Mecklenburg police, and we had an uprising of people in Charlotte, and this was, I think, one of the first times that a lot of the different silos of our community really came together to say that there's something wrong here. And I started going and paying attention to a bunch of different conversations that were happening, whether they were in government, whether they were in the faith community, whether they were just on the streets, of people knowing that there was something wrong here, there's something great here in Charlotte happening. But every time this city gets greater, we take next steps. Some of us seem to fall further and further behind. Later in 2017, in the spring of 2017, we had an entity called the Leading on Opportunity Task Force put out a report that was based on the Chetty study, which named us the worst major metropolitan city in America for upward economic mobility.
And that study came out of Harvard, am I right?
Yes,
Yeah.
That study came out of Harvard, and I believe Berkeley. And one thing that Charlotte does, I think, you know, as we do try to get out the shadow of, you know, of Atlanta, is we take very seriously when our image is nicked. You know, and that really was a big nick to say that we are the worst at something, despite all of our wealth, all of the beautiful, shiny things that we build. But that report, I think, really gave, provided a vernacular, right? These were things that we were feeling. That is why you had that uprising in the street. We knew that things were happening, but we didn't have the necessary language, you know, to connect those dots. And that report really did connect the dots, and it didn't say what entities had to do, but it gave suggestions. And one of the biggest suggestions for the city, the municipal side of things, was that the way we build neighborhoods, the ability to have affordable housing, and affordable meaning, and not just to pay rent, but you know, it's something we were talking about before this, the ability to get food, the ability
Right.
To pay for utilities, that there are structural policies that have been built and layered upon generations that have created this. And in order to solve that issue, we have to rethink, reimagine, deconstruct those layers of policy, and build more equitable ones. And so when I and you know, we were elected in 2017, we ran with that language, and we say, hey, we're not going to just keep studying this. There's something that we can do. We were in the middle of a unified development ordinance process, but we also saw that, hey, just doing that is, you know, making regulations, making a toolbox is no good if you don't have a blueprint for where you want to go.
So one of the things that we've done at the Housing Forum is not always talk about housing. We might talk about transportation choices, our schools, our health, public health, just as you're saying, to connect the dots. So if I understand it, you had a task force that really came back that was helpful to pivot off of. And that really came out of considering a new strategic plan. I know I read articles that your plan was out of date by about 40 years. We struggled with the same thing in Atlanta, but I think it's important for us to understand, the sequence. We look at a new strategic plan. How are we going to plan the city going forward? We're both growing like crazy. Then a task force to really focus on the issue gave you in a study that you could pivot off of. Is that correct?
That's very correct. And again, we were while this was all going on, we were still working on this unified development ordinance. Right. So if you have a UDO, but that you don't change, like I said, the blueprint, then you just have a better tools to do what you've been doing all along better. And if you don't really define, but then if you make those changes, if you don't define what those changes are, you can change to something that it won't. We can make changes, but that doesn't mean we're making the changes that get to a more equitable society. So
the phrase we often use here is "getting beyond ain't it awful," And so, what do we want to do, right?
Well, that's so important. So, what the comprehensive plan is, and it's important to know what it is a policy guiding document. So, but when we had to define, we had to create our North Star, right? Our direction, our goal of where we want to get to. And so we went into an engagement through a wide community engagement process over 2 years to ask that question. What do we want to change to? Ultimately,
and you went to neighborhood meetings and business council meetings.
We went to everything. I mean, we went to, like I said, faith communities. We went to community meetings. We went to schools, our CMS schools. We went to, to talk to young people. We went to other government entities. We tried to find any way that we can reach out to populations within our city that needed to be represented, that weren't represented. We came up with an equitable growth framework that is able to measure equity or lack thereof. This was something that the community had to tell us that is what they wanted, that they wanted an equitable society. And Charlotte,
when you say we, who is the we that went out? Was it a team of people? Was it city folks?
Our planning department, our city planning department was the lead kind of organizer of this. But through first in right after 2017, and we get to 2018, we hired a planning director. Our planning director position was vacant for almost 3 years at that point in time. And we hired a planning director whose kind of skill set was around building these comprehensive plans. And so when Mr. Jaoba came in, he really, we brought other consultants in as well to find, hey, how can we go out and engage people in ways around land use policies? Like, who knows about land use policies? Right. But do it in a way that engages folks. So we made many different things. For instance, we created a board game where people can decide different growth strategies, put them on different places of the map and see how those situations work out over time. While we had a hard board game, we even created a virtual board game so folks can do it on their smartphones. But that's just, again, one example of the different types of engagement.
So many different tools are needed. And if I'm hearing you correct, language is very important.
Oh, language.
How you frame.
Oh, absolutely. Not just language, though. I think one of the most important things, and this is something I've been learning over the past 4 years that I've been in office, you need the data, right? You need the data to inform that language, and the way you match the data and visualize that data, because that is really what we do as a government, right? We are a repository of information. So how do we visualize and communicate that data in ways and empower our citizens, our constituents, to utilize and visualize that data and language to clearly communicate, again, future policies over these next generations that, again, will hopefully achieve our ability to get to that North Star. If this comprehensive plan is like our North Star, now we know where we want to go, but we need a map, right? We have to map what the future of the city needs to look like to get there. So the next step that we're going to do is create our place type maps. Our place types will correspond with zoning districts, which will be codified in our UDO. And then when you have those place types and zoning, the massive rezoning of our entire city, that's where you have your map, but then you have to chart the course. Where are the other investments? Where are our capital investments? Where do they go along with the rezoning of an entire city? And where are our economic development dollars going to go? And then, of course, when we map that out and we chart a course, we're going to go along the course and we're going to learn from the wins and the losses and adjust as we go. And again, that is really what the comprehensive plan lets us do. We can go back and say, okay, that policy didn't necessarily work here. Here's another option that we can go to. We have a menu of a guiding document that can help us over the next generation. That's an amazing thing.
In bringing other council members along, because they represent their own constituency, and knowing that the framing and the language is so important, what were the winning arguments? I mean, I know you didn't convince everyone, but you're in a process. Was it around win-win for the different constituencies, or we're going to make a more equitable community? I mean, how did you bring folks along to support this?
So the number one thing was getting people smart about what this was versus what this wasn't, and getting them comfortable with plugging themselves into the process. Ultimately,
so let me ask you a loaded question here. Were you able to get the chamber to realize that a more equitable city is a better sell for business?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So, absolutely. So you did have some strange bedfellows here. You did have, Democrats and Republicans on both sides of this thing. You had businesses on both sides of these things. You had even folks from the real estate industries on both sides of these things. I think ultimately what the balance was, we had to decide that, whether we're going to stick with the status quo or we're going to, or we're being convinced that we have to go somewhere different. We have to realize in government in America, wherever we are in, is that even when we see a wrong, if something that we think is wrong, there's parts of our population that don't. Sure. And I won't even say that's not a good or bad thing. It's just a thing. It's your purview. It's the way, your lens sees things. For instance, because there has been this missing middle housing, there are certain business models that have thrived over time, developers, right, real estate folks. And, you understand the concerns from the perspective of all of a sudden the business landscape is going to change, Right. That's when you have more competition or different types of competition, all of a sudden that does affect business models. And you understand. That's why it's not necessarily a good or a bad thing, but ultimately we were able to convince more people that is for the good of Charlotte, for the good of North Carolina, for the good of America. We have to change the way we are approaching dealing with growth in our city. And we don't have, and we can't stop growth. People are going to keep having babies. People are going to want to keep coming here.
Exactly. If you were giving advice to all the folks listening today, and there could be hundreds of them, a broad cross-section of the community, what are just some core things you tell folks?
Well, we got to understand what our job is, each of us. And before we can intersect in our work, we really have to understand where we're at. It is the job of Charlotte City Council in a council manager form of government, which I think is different than Atlanta, which has a strong mayor, to really work on the high level policy guiding documents. And we can lead in that regard. But we can't, again, lead when it comes to business model formation. But we need, for instance, the chamber to really understand their role and how it interacts with what we're saying. We need the labor organizations to understand, okay, how does this affect workers? But to know how to plug into this, versus that this is not necessarily a fight. So if we are very aware and clear of the jobs that we each have to do within the system that we exist in, that's how we get a more, cogent conversation about pathways forward. Because in the end, we're trying to do things that we've never done before. And the only way you do that is to be confident in your skill set and the ability to do your job in an effective manner. And I think ultimately the 2+ years that went into planning, interacting, and communicating about that ultimately got us there by a slim margin.
Thank you so much. And I hope I can get you down to Atlanta sometime. We'll go for a good walk around town and share notes, but you're an inspiration. Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you guys. Thank you guys for paying attention. I can't wait to get down to that belt line, right?
All right. The invitation's open. I'll follow up with you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Councilman Winston.
Thank you.
Wow, that was a great interview. And I have to say, Councilman Winston is coming down, and I've promised him some Georgia barbecue coming from North Carolina. So we'll stay in contact. We'll track each other. I think a number of things. It takes a lot of tools to do the job. I love the idea of having a board game. It reminds me of what we did in Midtown, 10, 15 years ago. The tools we used to imagine this, the Midtown that we wanted. Data is key, and that's the importance of Eric and Elizabeth and ARC and the folks who provide the data. We have to be proactive and listen to folks. We have to be proactive and listen to folks in the community. We need to build coalitions and collaborations. We need to map things and, getting people comfortable with their roles. So many lessons here, and we're not going to do Q&A because the council person couldn't be here to answer, but we will be hearing again from them. All right, to get to part of what the councilman was talking about, I want to bring up Ernest Brown and Joel Dixon. We'll pivot to zoning experts and the elected officials and the grassroots work that's going on to educate and engage the neighborhood residents. So please welcome Ernest Brown from Neighborhoods for More Neighbors, and Wimby Action, and developer Joel Dixon from Urban Oasis Development. Ernest, welcome. Let's start with you. Can you tell us a little about the two organizations you're affiliated with? How do we bring new voices into the conversation about housing choice? How do we see out of the Bay Area in terms of the movements and support and zoning reform?
Thanks so much, Bill. So first, a little bit on myself. I'm from Atlanta. I'm born and raised here, but I spent a few years in the Bay Area, and that's where YIMBY Action got started. So I got there in 2016 as that movement was beginning to build. And YIMBY Action takes itself kind of the opposite of NIMBY. So not in my backyard, well, yes, in my backyard. And the origin story is sort of people who happen to be a bit younger, realizing that the decisions about zoning and housing that were sort of blocking them out of being able to buy a home or even find a place to rent that they could afford were being made in the middle of the day in rooms with elected officials and pretty much only senior citizens being engaged in the process about how should our cities change and grow. And so a group of folks said, well, we're going to go to those same meetings. We're going to take off our lunch break, go down to City Hall and say, it'd actually be okay to have a few more apartments in our neighborhood because the rents are too high and we can't deal with that. And just a backdrop on San Francisco for those who don't know, a point Eric made during his presentation about are we willing to bear the cost of not growing or not changing rather? And in San Francisco, you are eligible for low-income housing and you can still make six figures. So they have chosen to not allow the housing growth that has produced a situation where even someone making six figures may need support to afford housing. So you cannot income your way out of it when you've made the choices they have. And that's why it got so acute and so dire there. But so YIMBY Action comes around and says, well, we have to get more people involved in this conversation because the existing actors are not delivering solutions that work for everyone. And it really speaks to that ladder, again, that you saw in the Kronberg team's presentation. And it was no longer just people not making that much money couldn't afford housing. You could be on a good job, making well into six figures, and still having a hard time affording even rental housing, let alone ownership housing. So that the crisis climbs the ladder if you don't address it at an earlier stage. So YIMBY actually collects these people who are experiencing various pieces of the housing crisis happening there and says we need to pour ourselves into planning commission. We need to identify the city council members who sort of understand this issue. And we need to go knock on doors for candidates who are willing to be champions of this issue. And I would say in 2016, the sort of the emblematic story is that Scott Wiener, running for state senator after having served on San Francisco's county council, says, I'm going to own this issue if you put me into office. And in a very close election, he beats out his competitor, and he becomes a champion for these kinds of issues in the California state legislature. And that becomes basically an early win that kind of proves the point that if there are people willing to say, yes, we need to do this, not simply in the data and the reports, which are fundamental, but in the realm of politics, which is what elected officials look to when they decide, am I going to lose my job? Am I going to get my next job if I take this position? If there's no one willing to support them and taking what could be a leap of faith at times, they won't take that jump. And so YIMBY actually tries to give them some courage to take that leap, and hopefully a soft landing if they take it, because there's going to be support from the community, from the voters, should they take those courageous steps. So that's kind of the origin and how it sort of comes to be. Neighbors for More Neighbors is very much in the same vein. So the same vision, but one for Metro Atlanta, of how do we create a vision of our region, not just our cities, that is accepting of the new people that the numbers say are going to come. And frankly, the way I see it is we have two choices. We can take the San Francisco approach, which is to put your head in the sand, frankly, for 20 years and have prices go up and up and up until only the very richest can afford to stay, and with scarce subsidy dollars, keep a few people hanging on amidst that. Or we can see that growth as an opportunity, do some of the reforms we've talked about, and have a broader discussion amongst not just people who are involved in housing, but people who live in housing, people who work in small businesses and need neighbors to patronize their businesses, about the way that growth is going to lift all of our boats if we do it right. And I'll be frank, that's not the default choice, that the growth benefits everyone. That's why some people are afraid of the change it brings. But if we are proactive and thoughtful, we can create that kind of situation and the way we experience that growth. So just tactically, Eric pointed this out, to pass legislation in Atlanta, you need 8 votes. So a lot of the work we do is, well, how do we get 8 votes? Do we have 8 votes on council today? And if not, where do we go get some more votes from? So our plan, which is already well in motion, is we've sent out endorsement questionnaires to all the candidates running for city council and mayor in Atlanta. We're going to host forums in late August after qualifying in early September to hear from them about what are their plans on these housing and transit related issues. And then we will make clear to them and to the voters of the city who we think has a plan and the willingness to take action on that plan to address these challenges, who is going to pass the zoning reforms that we were just talking about, and not simply let them sit on the shelf and not go anywhere. And we're going to do everything we can, from canvassing to door knocking to small dollar donations, to help those people get in office and then hold them accountable for delivering on what we've been talking about today. I think it was so critical what the council member from Charlotte was sharing, and that there is a community education piece of this, and then that's a responsibility of both the advocacy community and local government. But at some point, there comes a vote, and he needed to have the votes to get that across. And that's on us as the advocates to make sure that that whomever's pushing this in Atlanta has the support they need to get to 8 votes. If they can't get to 8 votes, everything we're talking about dies in the vine. And so that's really the framework under which we work.
Ernest, I'm glad you moved back to Atlanta, man. We need you here. And your ideas of actually grassroots organizing, of listening to the candidates, telling them what we think is important, trying to figure out who's on board. I mean, you really got to get down to the street level to do that. So thank you for all that work. In the interest of time, I'm going to move from Ernest to Joel, and then we'll come back and see if there's questions. Joel, welcome. You're a developer, a co-principal of Urban Oasis Development, as well as a neighborhood advocate. Can I ask you to wear both hats for a minute, as a developer and as an advocate in the neighborhood? from the neighborhood resident perspective and from a developer perspective, why is this important? Why do we need residential zoning reform? And I'm going to throw in a couple more questions so you can kind of cover it all. Some of these changes are going to be tough path for approval. We know that. How do we get more neighborhood residents on the south side and the west side exposed to the data and the value of these reforms? What are we hearing when we get to historically devastated communities and we're proposing new housing there? And then we'll come back for questions for both of you. So, Joel, welcome to the Housing Forum.
Thank you so much, Bill. Such an honor and a pleasure. Participated as a viewer on many of these forums, and it's always very helpful and informative to me because as you asked me to wear both hats, that's my everyday, is that I'm a neighbor, I'm a resident. And so I attend these forums to learn about how to be more impactful for the city that I love and that I was raised in. I mean, I grew up here in Atlanta. I grew up right downtown in John Hope University Homes, Castleberry Hill, West Side area. And so it's very much a part of who I am and having seen Atlanta develop. And having returned, I actually was in Silicon Valley in the Bay Area for a while, professionally and academically, but returning back to Atlanta and seeing the changes that were happening in Atlanta, even in the early 2000s, while I was not in real estate at the time, is really when I started thinking about how the impact of just real estate, period, is going to impact the city. And having lived in the Bay Area, I saw how much of a detrimental impact a lot of real estate was to neighborhoods all throughout the Bay. And of course, it's just been mentioned by Ernest. It was mentioned during Promberg, Eric, and Elizabeth's presentation. What happens if you just stick your head in the sand and the detriment it caused to neighborhoods and affordability and access. So just know that, you know, all of what I'm doing as a developer purely came from me as just a neighbor and resident who sat here and watched in the early 2000s Eastlake happen and become gentrified, watched Kirkwood happen and be gentrified, watching unfold, you know, Reynoldstown happen, and knew that it was not going to stop there, that this was going to unfold throughout the rest of Atlanta, including the South Side and West Side neighborhoods, which we're experiencing today. And so as I talk about, you know, this issue and discuss it, I'm always a neighbor. And that's why what Braxton said is important. Data is data. We're going to grow by 700,000 people, maybe slightly less, maybe slightly more. Either way, we're not on a pathway to accomplish anything close to the housing that's going to allow for us to do that in a way that allows for equity, for inclusion, and continues the type of economic development that Atlanta has, you know, really held its hat on. And that data being the case, one other piece of data that's important, and everybody says it, and I reinforce it, is that not just redlining, but pervasive, comprehensive, exclusionary, single-family only zoning, large minimum lot zoning, all of these policies with systemic racism by another name. And that has created and continues to perpetuate the things that it wanted to do, which doesn't just include race, but includes classism that makes things unaffordable for only a select few, creates non-diverse housing that then eliminates and excludes a large variety of folks, not just by race, but by a variety of means. When you go and look at the Bay Area right now, the exclusion is not just by race, it's by, if you're a teacher, guess what? You can't live there. If you work for the police force, you can't live there. If you work for the fire department, you can't work there. This is not race-based. This is going to eliminate a whole swath of folks based on class. And so as a neighbor who lives in historic Adair Park now, I live literally a mile from where I grew up, I experienced also firsthand and seeing a street, my own street, where back in the 1920s, 30s, was a street that had 27 households that lived in everything from single family houses to duplexes to quadruplexes, in a walkable school district with a walkable park, and saw 27% of that housing and therefore households immediately disappear and become basically non-conforming as a result of zoning that no longer allowed legally for a two-family residential household or a quad. So anytime now that those units became purchased, renovated, they had to lose a unit at least because they had to become a single-family house. Now, at this point, I live in a single-family house on that street, and I'm a big proponent of home ownership. I'm a big proponent of single-family housing. And one of the narratives that as a neighbor, I had to start figuring out, because for me, I grew up in an Atlanta where these neighborhoods were horrible. Like nothing on the South Side, West Side was anywhere that you would love to be at for the most part in the urban setting. And a lot of that had single family houses and duplexes and what's called boarding houses. It was not managed well. As the neighborhoods were neglected, so was the housing. And so the perception for me was also very negative about those types of zoned housing, duplexes, triplexes, any of that stuff, quads, it all felt terrible. But it was with time as a neighbor, once again, recently here in Atlanta, and then as a developer, that I came to provide better context, which is, well, was it really the type of housing, or was it just the way that housing was being represented? Because all types of housing can be neglected and can provide for safety issues. It doesn't mean it's based on it being a 2-family or 3-family. It just means that it's been neglected. And so that put a different spin also to what Braxton said. Once you start getting language around some of the things that I was just experiencing as a neighbor and a resident, it changes things. So once I started understanding, yes, Atlanta took over that ownership of that upward mobility last place. And you begin to see that this city that we call too busy to hate and a great blossoming city isn't a mobile city for all. Why is that? Start seeing, okay, that these neighborhoods are not accessible to all anymore. Why is that when we have so much land? And that's where, for me, I began to think about becoming a developer, and urban oasis development came into play, because whatever we were doing before is not going to work for where we're going. It hasn't worked for any other cities that have already gone through this transformation, and it's not going to work in Atlanta. What we have, though, is the benefit as neighbors and residents of putting policy, like Braxton said, into action today, and supporting efforts like Amir Faroukhi's today that will allow us to be in a much better position than the Bay Area and Seattle. And while I always talk about, Bill, from a neighbor perspective, the systemic aspect of it and the class aspect of it, this is an economic development issue. And this is where I'll put my developer hat on. When I go into neighborhoods as a developer, I provide, and Eric Kronberg and Elizabeth have helped me with this in many cases. We've done something in English Avenue. We've done some things in other places where we're showing just cold hard data, which is, if you are a neighbor and a resident of Atlanta who believes in inclusion and wants to see everybody be able to be here, and also wants to have a transformative neighborhood that doesn't make gentrification a 4-letter word, what is not exciting about taking a land piece that right now would have 1 unit with 1 household, and just with a flip of zoning allow for 4 units, 4 households at an affordable price point that now is 100% area median income, 65% area median income for home ownership. This isn't just for rental, this is home ownership. What about that is something that we as neighbors say we want in Atlanta, but the only way to accomplish that and do it very simply is through housing choice, which requires some amount of zoning reform. And I love what James Alexander said earlier, which is we can't subsidize our way to affordability. So everybody who wants an affordable Atlanta, this is not just going to come from one tool in the toolbox, which is more money. It's going to come from subsidy alongside of the things that we can do without subsidy, which is just allow for better and more efficient use of housing. And I know I'm saying a lot, but I also want to cover one more point, because
quickly.
Yeah, but it was mentioned by Maria Supporter about the canopy. And this is a big thing, that housing and zoning reform does not reduce canopy and destroy our canopy. In fact, you're talking about a more efficient use of land. So if you're going to have to take down a tree, but now you're getting 2 residences and households, 3 residences and households, why is that not better than taking down a tree and having a single resident and household? And as the Atlanta City Design notes, if you're also placing that effectively between conservation areas, more dense areas, then you're also doing it in a way that actually benefits the overall tree canopy, not neglects it. So thank you so much, Bill.
Excellent point. And I think to go back to some of Eric's slides of showing, well-managed multiplex, in a neighborhood. Your point very well made, Joel, that that image of those that haven't been kept up because of finances or whatever, is the wrong image. These things can fit into the neighborhoods just fine. Let me just bring both of you back in and ask, what did you take away from the city council person in Charlotte? Any best practices or things? And I know I'm going to be looking you guys up when he comes down to visit Atlanta so that you guys can meet. What is any takeaways that would be helpful to the group?
I would offer two quick takeaways. One is just want to again highlight, they created digestible ways of educating the community about the importance of this issue. So a board game, which is something we've done as well in the Bay Area about to Waken Up. In 15 minutes, can you appreciate the tensions and trade-offs between tree canopy, population, transit, business growth, like getting people to see how even if they're not super concerned about zoning and housing on their own merits, they see how it connects to other things they care about. That is just so fundamentally important to bringing more people into the conversation. The second one is identifying other known interest groups and helping them see what they have to gain from this. So the building and construction trades, a classic one. But what are we doing to create stable, if we're going to achieve the levels of growth Eric was showing on his slide, those aren't jobs, those are careers. Because we're saying over the next 20 years, every year, thousands of units, you can build a career off of that rather than just occasional spotty employment. So that's a tremendous opportunity to bring more people into seeing what they have to gain from these changes rather than strictly what they have to fear from these changes.
Excellent. Joel, any takeaways?
I know that there's one question that will be brought in here, so I'll just piggyback on that to say, as Braxton mentioned about the key being data and how you allow communities and neighbors to be better educated and have the visualization on what these issues really are without it being kind of just about lingo and terminology. You got to bring it to the streets at eye level and make it understandable of how and why this is important. And so I think that that's an extremely important aspect of what we're doing, even with the Neighbors for More Neighbors effort.
And Rose Johnson, one of the participants here, I think a very important question. The Housing Justice League asked, what is the role of grassroots organizations? I know, Joe, as a developer, it sounds like you have a relationship with the neighborhood that you're developing. You want to listen and know them, in the same way. So where's grassroots organizations fit into this campaign?
Yeah, just like any other effort that grassroots is important for, it's on the education and awareness, being informed. A lot of this is not about things that, are just trying to be, a wool over somebody's head. It's just that a lot of times neighbors and neighborhoods don't understand this. They don't know the ramifications. They don't know the impact. I didn't know it, and I've been here for a long time. And so I think with grassroots, it's becoming aware, understanding that this issue is as significant as any as it relates to equity, inclusion, and justice that I can think of. And then talking to the right folks so that you can then, through your grassroots efforts, begin reaching all of the levels that you're currently embedded. And for me, as a developer who gets to be in front of neighborhoods and neighborhood MPUs, I'm always trying to bring that awareness and inform, regardless of whether it's for a project that, I want them to support. It's just to make sure they better see what the ramifications are. And so I really appreciate the grassroots folks following up on some of the information that's been presented today and reaching out to some of the folks.
Thanks. And Ernest, I know you believe in this. Just a word on it.
Just quickly, Rose, I don't want to scare you or anyone else who has this question, but elected officials will not champion this issue unless they know that there's a reward for championing it. Because this is a scary issue, that they know they're going to get opposition on this issue. When we saw the proposals come out, there were thousands of calls to city council. So that this could be a scary issue for elected officials. So if grassroots groups don't let them know, there are people who are going to back you and support you, help you with that education piece, that we may not see the leadership we need on this issue. So grassroots groups are critical to succeeding on this. Excellent.
Thank you, gentlemen. I mean, you're always such a great resource to the forum, both for participating all these years, but being a resource to us. Again, I wish we had more time, but we'll see you again. All right, let's pivot a little bit. We're really focused on Atlanta quite a bit because we got elections coming up of council and mayor, so we're in a political season. But we know we're also a regional forum, and these issues are coming up all over the region. And we will not solve things in Atlanta if we don't solve them in the region. So for a regional perspective, I'd like to ask Melanie Couchman, our friend from Sandy Springs Together. Melanie, you're an active participant in the forum. We've had you here before. We've been talking with experts in the city, but what's happening in Sandy Springs. You and your husband, David, created Sandy Springs together some years ago. I know I've been out to speak to the group several times to engage, educate, and empower Sandy Spring residents about the need to preserve and create more affordable housing. Tell us about some of your priorities. What's going on there?
Well, thank you, Bill, for having me. I've been in the audience, as you know, and in person for many years, and it's really an honor to be on the panel today. So thank you for having me and having me shine a light on what's going out here in Sandy Springs. I think first, I'd just like to put into context what our challenges are out here, because Sandy Springs is a little different from the city of Atlanta, in that instead of having neighborhoods with single family homes on single lots, we have literally over 10,000 multifamily NOAA apartments in a 4-mile stretch along Roswell Road. And many of these apartments are being sold and renovated at a wholesale, not in terms of price, but we have, these apartments are anywhere from 20 to 100 acres, and they're being renovated. And when they're renovated, the rents are going up, and our renters are being displaced because they're being priced out of their apartments. Many of these apartments are 90% occupied, and it's where a lot of our teachers and our first responders and other workers essential to our economy have lived and are living. We also have in Sandy Springs a supply gap of 5,270 rental units today. And we also have a supply gap of 1,800 owner homes. And this is all for people making 50% or less of AMI. So we have some rather urgent needs, but our immediate priority is to see if we can get our city council to include inclusionary zoning. We have exclusionary zoning right now. We do not have inclusionary zoning. We have by right zoning. But if we can get them to include inclusionary zoning, so when an owner of one of these larger apartment communities goes for a building permit to renovate, if we can get them to set aside 30%, 20% of the units and maintain them as affordable, that's really our first priority right now, because these apartments, we have right now 1,600 of them that are under renovation, and the rents are going to be going up. And our concern is that a lot of these families and renters are going to be displaced.
You know, and I know, Melanie, you have forums very much like this housing forum. You have forums in Sandy Springs.
We do.
Engaging public officials, citizens. What messaging do people respond to in a favorable way? What's resonating?
Well, the messaging that's responding that we're having the most success with is when we talk about families being able to put down roots and the need for the city to offer a ladder of economic mobility. The residents in our community, a lot of them really do embrace the diversity. And so we make sure that people understand that without a diverse choice of housing, we will lose that diversity. In addition, we have a lot of employers out here that are major employers like UPS and Mercedes, and those employers have voiced concern about being able to recruit employees because we don't have a choice of housing. And then also the other thing that we try to do is we try to stay away from the American Dream strategy in our messaging, because that pits owners against renters. And, you know, this city was founded on an anti-apartment belief system, and that anti-apartment belief system is very prevalent still today. So we try not to talk about the American dream, but rather support the message that whether you're paying for rent or paying a mortgage, and you have to have a place to dream and plan your future, and that we're all invested in the future of our community, and our future is only certain when we can work together to support the policies that benefit everybody. So those are some of the messages that resonate. But I also wanted to go back, Bill, to this concept of a regional problem, because out here in the suburbs, we don't have some of the resources that are available to the city of Atlanta. And the challenge that we have is, if we don't address this as a regional problem, our experience is that developers, and I'm not making developers out to be the bad guys, but developers will play one municipality off of another. And so they're going to go wherever they have the least resistance to build what they want to build. And out here in the suburbs, if we don't have a regional solution to this, then if we were to adopt inclusionary zoning for renovations of apartments, then those developers will just go someplace else where they don't have to comply with inclusionary zoning.
Correct.
So we've got a real problem by not addressing this as a regional issue. But the other problem that we have is, because there's so much focus on the city of Atlanta, we have what I call a talent desert, because all of the advocates, all of the resources of knowledge and funding and expertise is focused on the city of Atlanta. And it's really difficult to raise that level of consciousness, raise that level of awareness, when we don't have a lot of people in our city that get it. And I think that goes to what Joel was saying, what Ernest was saying, that you've got to be able to educate the community. And we do educate the community, but in terms of people really getting it and being able to speak truth to power, most of that effort is happening in downtown Atlanta, but we've got the same challenges out here. So,
absolutely, Melanie. A point well taken, and the very point of why this is a regional housing forum. It started out as the Atlanta Housing Forum, back in the 80s, and what you're conveying became very obvious to us through the years. So that's with the support of ARC and others. So stay with us. We're here for you. I think, getting your big headquarter companies, the UPS, Mercedes, your hospitals, to weigh in on the importance of employees, of people having access to their jobs is a real key asset you have there.
Yes.
Thank you, Melanie. Thanks for all the work you and David have done through the years.
Thank you for having me, Bill.
All right, we're going to move on. We're running a little bit behind, but we want to get everything in. On multiple occasions, we've addressed issues of rental relief during the housing forum. You might remember that we worked on this a lot last year, and one of the key organizations and key people that we keep coming back to, because they play a central role on eviction relief, is Michael Lucas from the Atlanta Volunteer Lawyers Foundation. So Michael, I know we keep pulling you back up, but you're the expert that we trust, and I know you're right in the middle of it. We've just learned that the ARC eviction tracker now has building level data. You might speak a little bit about why that's so important. You can see it on the screen. We in Georgia have distributed only 6%, let me say it again, 6% of the rental relief funds. Not unlike other cities. This has been a big lift for everybody. We know that some counties, jurisdictions doing better than others. Fulton is at 48%. Kudos to them. Cobb at 35%. DeKalb at 10%. Atlanta at 30%. Clayton at 13%. Given the gravity of the situation, why aren't these numbers closer to 80 or 90%? That's what we were hoping for. What are the issues at play? And could you give us some perspective kind of on where we are right now? Welcome, Michael. Appreciate you taking time to be here.
Thank you, Bill.
There you go.
Even better unmuted. I appreciate you having me for this. And obviously it takes a little different form in each jurisdiction, but I think what it comes down to, if I may, Bill, is that we don't trust poor people. We have systems, and it's so ingrained, it's almost reflective and thoughtless, that simply don't trust poor people, right? What's happening right now, I think, is a moral issue, and I will get to the specifics. I know that's what you want, but for just a second, I think it's a moral issue, and with the aspects of how the impact plays out, it's a racial equity issue. But again, in these systems, at bottom, I think we're not trusting poor people in this moment of crisis. To get to the more practical, Bill, and answer your question, and what I think it looks like, and again, this varies by jurisdiction, but we still have far more onerous eligibility and documentation requirements, and in a lot of cases enforced with a pretty high level of scrutiny than even the federal government is requiring at this point. It may have gone less noticed than something like the moratorium issues, but Biden administration and the Treasury issued guidance to all jurisdictions that they can, really lean into eased requirements, really lean into allowing for self-attestation from residents without other documentation required. And jurisdictions across the country that have had real success, I think, have embraced that. But I believe not embracing that still is the story. I know in Atlanta, and I say that as leading one of the agencies that's participating in distributing the funds, there's significantly more flexibility allowed to jurisdictions than has been taking advantage of, and kind of this culture of compliance too often trumps a culture of compassion.
And let me just say, Michael, is that when we look at counties that have done a better job, is it because they are taking advantage of things they could do?
Yes. I mean, I am looking even to outside of Georgia for that. There was a study that kind of flew around kind of advocates networks from a program. God, I hope I get it right here, but out of Indiana, and anybody smarter than me maybe can add it to the chat, that really succeeded in getting those funds out there quickly. And they had a really simplified online process that, again, allowed for the devil's in the details with the documentation requirements for the clients most in need of this, isolated, who don't have 4 pay stubs, who don't have a separation notice from their employer that says it was related to COVID, or can't go back to that employer at whatever job they had 4 months ago to get it. The devil's in those kind of details. And these jurisdictions that I think have had real success have said, look, the federal guidelines allow us to accept self-attestation or alternative documents for things, and we're going to accept that and get these funds out and not kind of lead with distrust. I say that saying that everybody trying to get this right is well-meaning and rolling it out, but we're seeing how it plays out and how there's such a high level of denial, not because I believe people aren't eligible, but that they can't come up with the required documentation in enough time to show it.
Michael, this reminds me, and I know I've used the example before when I was at the food bank working with FNS and USDA on summer feeding. I mean, you just sit down there for months and say, how do we get there? The way this thing is structured, we can't feed folks. And,
Yep.
and I think a parallel kind of situation here. Any last comments about kind of what we can do as far as the folks involved in the housing forum
Sure.
to help?
Well, similar to kind of the advice that I think that Neighbors for Our Neighbors, our colleague there, shared. I mean, I think we're not going to see change at this till there's more of a clamoring for it. We started to get some attention around the moratorium expired, but I fear that the focus is going to move away from this issue again, because some of it is in the minutia of the requirements. But if there's the political will to kind of ease up and get this funds out across jurisdictions, I think that there could be those changes. Again, how we move forward, an easing of the eligibility and documentation requirements, and a focus on easing access over compliance. And then I have to add, Bill, and I'm speaking for all the providers, not just AVLF, the other pieces of this has been incredibly burdensome to the providers who are helping everybody get through those applications. Only 8 of us, down from the 24, I think it was, in Atlanta, kind of agreed to continue to help with this. It was a moral decision on our part, I can say, whether it was a wise one or not, but it's been a real struggle in terms of the reimbursement in a system where only a third of all the people you're trying to help get eligible and complete their applications end up getting that assistance. And so if we're struggling like that, and we're at a moment where I think we need more providers out in the community helping those. Because what happens is the folks who have the most wherewithal to get that separation notice or to get bank statements get help. And we know it's the most isolated, the folks who are most hurting, who can't do that. I think we solve that through more provider involvement. And there's a lot of us who don't know if we can stick with the process all the way through the rest of the year, Bill.
I can appreciate that. It really is both a moral decision for you to take your organization in this direction, but certainly a moral question for the community.
Yep.
We want to do right by people. The resources are there. We have a methodology of getting there. And we're not calling out anybody as good or bad. We're just saying this is really hard work. And we've really got to figure out a way to get it done. We send the money back when people are getting kicked out of their apartments.
That's right.
Michael, thanks to you.
Thank you, Bill.
I know you had to jump out of a board meeting to get to us today, so I also appreciate that.
Okay, my pleasure. Thank you.
All right, I want to thank some folks and then just make some final comments. First of all, George Bergen, who's our producer, director, creative guy. We wouldn't be here with all these speakers and recordings without you, George, and the support of ANDP. The forum steering committee members, Bruce Gunner from Civitas Housing and James Alexander from Mercy Housing Southeast. They really did the bulk of the work of putting this forum together. And of course, Marissa Ghani from ARC, is our host, is our support, and is support for data. So Marissa, thank you very much. Thank the advisory board, which you can see on the screen. We are in communication all the time and getting ideas from them. Again, important to listen to the diversity of the community. And special thanks to all of you, our audience, for turning in and learn about the topic and getting engaged. I also want to thank KB Advisory Group for their small group discussions, the follow-up discussions from this forum. I would like nothing more than to be back in the room together. The meetings before the meetings and after the meetings we're missing, except if you choose to be in those discussions. So we're going to do everything we can as we look at public health and the safety of being together to get back together. We've continued to have a primary focus on equity in creating our programs this year, and we'll continue to do so. But I think the issue is clearly larger than land use and zoning. It's just the latest and kind of most used argument. I think the bigger question is, what type of city do we want to create? A city for all people, a city that embraces creative ideas around urban development, a city that embraces sincere people who want to make things better for their neighbors, no matter their station in life. Change is constant. Density will come, as it has done for the past 176 years since the creation of Atlanta. We can either do it smartly or pay the price yet again. It affects the quality of life for all our citizens and, quite frankly, for business development. We are in a political season with evictions looming. Affordable housing is a big issue, maybe one of the biggest in the city. We can see that the issue has already come up in mayoral and city council town hall meetings. No matter the subject, this question is getting asked. I want to remind everyone that the Housing Forum was created over 30 years ago to create a safe place to talk about hard and complex issues of developing affordable housing. This is hard to talk about, particularly now when everything is so adversarial and fear-based. As we put ourselves in the council or the commissioner seat, we can see how difficult it is to satisfy every constituency. So I think some empathy is required. Without more affordable housing, it is more challenged to secure employees for local businesses, to engage and develop the tax base, to be on a more creative edge in urban and suburban development. It ultimately affects our ability to educate our children, to ensure better quality of life and certainly better health and environmental outcomes. And I think it's important that that's the way we frame this work. Our challenge is no different than leaders who've had to address it in the past. We wouldn't have a Midtown as we know it today. We wouldn't have Morehouse and Spelman and Georgia Tech and GSU and Emory interfacing with the community that we have today. We wouldn't have high-end communities like Hansley Park or Midtown, the 04th Ward, because those developments were feared and blocked in their day in the city. What we do know is we need each other engaged, informed, and prepared for action. Together, we will keep this on our agenda, advocate for better solutions, and find win-win ways to create a city for all. And thank you all for participating, being active in this issue, for active in the Housing Forum, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.